Hi everyone. I want to go over some stuff having to do with the government class foundational ideas, beginning things that we're starting in this cycle. This video is to support you guys being able to complete the Junipod with the same name, and also to have additional background information that you can utilize. I know sometimes it's hard to get everything when we're talking about it in the Zoom meeting, so this is an additional backup to help with that. You can stop the video, rewind it, rewatch parts if you feel that that's necessary. Please be reminded though that your participation credit in the class does come from attending the Zoom classes. That is 10% of your final grade, right? So let's get started with talking about some of these foundational ideas in government. So if I go to my website, right, in government class, I'm going to go into class notes, and here is the website, and the link is also in Jupyter Ed. So if we are going to go look at foundational ideas, right, we're really talking about the Constitution. The Constitution is what actually forms our federal government, okay? The document is what it is. It's over 200 years old. The words are not changing unless an amendment is added to the Constitution. And that is a very difficult process to go through in order to pass a constitutional amendment. Okay. So why is it that the Constitution is called a living document? That has to do with its interpretation, how we figure out what the meaning of those words are. So the example I always use in class is this. It's September, right? It's the end of summer. And let's say you get a text message, Facebook post, Instagram, whatever it is that you guys do these days to communicate with each other in written form. Whatever it is, you get that message in written form from your summer love, and they're dumping you out of the blue. You were so happy. How are you going to feel about that at first? Most people would be confused, angry, upset, sad. But if you fast forward about 6 months, let's say Valentine's Day, and you're with your new boo, and you like them even better, and you look at that other person that you were with over the summer and what's going on with them right now, and you think, man, dodged a bullet. They're a hot mess, right? And you go look at that communication again, that written communication. Are you going to feel the same way about it? No. Most likely, things have evolved. The words haven't changed, right? When you first read those words, it might have been, the shock, upset, anger, all of those things. But then you go back 6 months later when you're with somebody else and you read those exact same words and they mean something completely different to you. So what changed? You changed. You changed as a person. Your relationship with those words and what you felt like what they meant, how you interpreted their meaning has changed because you have changed as a person. Your perspectives have changed. And that's how the Constitution works. That's what we mean by a living document. Interpreting the meaning of the Constitution is going to mean one thing in 1790, and it's going to mean something completely different in 2020, especially when you take a look at the idea of rights. 1790, you don't have a lot of people who are, on the list for considering their rights. Women didn't have the right to vote. African Americans weren't free, right? So that was not a universal interpretation of who has free speech, right? But if you fast forward in time, our society has changed a lot. We recognize the equal rights of women, and we recognize the equal rights of African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans and LGBTQ, and our definition of who's quote unquote included has greatly expanded. So when we read the Constitution, we read it with a different intent. We automatically include, as a society, a lot of those other groups, but that changes over time. So That's one of the purposes of fighting for societal change, is because as we change as a society, how we interpret the Constitution is going to change as well. So some basics. We have three branches of government, right? We have the legislative branch. This branch consists of Congress, right, who's responsible for making the federal laws. And that's what our next pod is going to be about, the legislative branch. So they basically write the laws. The executive branch is the branch that the president is within, right? The executive branch is not just the president, but includes other jobs and functions. And the job of the executive branch is to execute laws, right? To put them into action, to administer them, and to enforce laws, because laws are meaningless without enforcement. If nobody's enforcing the rules, nobody's going to bother listening to the rules, right? And the judicial branch. The judicial branch is responsible for interpreting the laws. And that's it. They just interpret the laws. The judicial branch does not enforce their interpretations. Enforcement goes to the executive branch. The judicial branch does not fix laws that are in violation of the Constitution. That is the job of the legislative branch. The job of the judicial branch is just to look at a law in a particular case. When somebody challenges a law, look at the law, look at the Constitution, listen to arguments, and decide whether or not that law is in agreement with the Constitution or violates the Constitution. The first foundational principle I want to talk about is popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is this idea that government power lies with the people. The people have power and influence in their government. It's this idea of the consent of the governed. The people give their permission to the government to exist. And it also has to do with this idea of social contract, right? Social contract theory states that the people give up their will, they follow the rules, as long as the government's generally providing safety and security, right? But if the government is not protecting the people, that government should be dissolved. In early American history, in fact, in order to form America, the United States, we picked up guns and we fought against the British. In the Civil War, we fought with guns against one another. We overturn government very regularly and dissolve government very regularly, but we don't usually do it with violence. We usually do it through the electoral process. So if you don't like an administration, if you don't like your senator, if you don't like your local representative, then the next time to vote, go vote. Go vote for somebody else. If you do like your representation, you should go out and support them. Now, I know people who, get upset about voting and feel like it doesn't matter, but it really does. But another thing that matters, and I'm not going to show the whole video, is the census. So we do not directly elect our president. We cast our votes, and those go to the electoral college, which decides the actual election. And what decides the electoral college is the census. Okay, so we'll talk more about this another day. But in brief, a lot of what we do in this class is to talk about how to become more involved in government. And this is a very simple way to get involved in government. When you fill out the census, you're actually telling the government how many people live in an area, and that helps the government allocate resources. So funding for Head Start programs, funding for playgrounds, school funding, officers, fire department, all of these things, hospitals, it all comes from the census. So that's how the federal government decides to spend money in certain neighborhoods. So the more people that fill out the census, the more we demonstrate a need for those sorts of services. Filling out that census can also impact the electoral college, because People move around a lot these days. And when people don't fill out the census but do sign up to vote, you end up with this disconnect. So you might have a lot of voters in a certain geographic area, but they didn't fill out the census. So they don't have enough electoral college members to reflect how many voters are in that area. So those two really work in conjunction when it comes to presidential elections. Okay, for presidential elections. This video I showed in class. If you were not there, you missed it, but I will put the link to this video in the comments section of this video. Back to the foundational principles. So one of the basic ideas is this idea of separation of powers. We don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. We don't want to put all power in one branch of the government because it's very easy for a dictatorship to form at that point. When power is consolidated, you have people who are able to take control, implement their vision, whether it is with the people or against the people's wishes. It's a very efficient form of government. You have to do whatever the person says. But if you don't like the person, too bad. It's not a representative form of government. So here we separate the powers: legislation, writes laws. The executive branch enforces laws and implements laws. Judicial does the interpreting. Okay. And they also have checks and balances on each other to make sure they don't get too powerful. But those checks and balances really only work if they're being utilized by the branches of government. So each branch has a certain number of checks, things it can do to put an obstacle in the path of another branch of government if that branch is getting too powerful. So if Congress passes a law that the president doesn't agree with, the president doesn't have to sign it into law. The president can veto that legislation, and it's not a law unless there's an alternate path used. Okay, Supreme Court, if there's a law that's in violation of our Constitution, the Supreme Court can void that law. And the Senate has the ability to approve treaties, approve presidential appointments like the Supreme Court, which is in the news right now, right? And Congress also has the ability and responsibility, I would argue, to investigate other branches of government, like the executive branch. But if that branch of government, like Congress, is unwilling to use its power to check another branch, like the executive, then that executive branch is free to grow as much power as they wish, okay, and to grow unchecked. So judicial review is just this idea that the Supreme Court's power is to interpret laws. It is not to correct laws, fix laws, or enforce any laws. And I do want to go over this idea of federalism. Federalism is the idea that the central government doesn't control all the power in our country, right? States have powers that are reserved to them. And you also kind of have government is set up like, I like to say, like a bloomin' onion, right? So it doesn't just have layers, but sometimes those layers kind of overlap a little, right? So if you look at COVID response in government, what you have is different responses by different layers of government. The federal government at this time is kind of saying a number of things, but do they have an overarching policy? They're not really enforcing it very firmly. We have recommendations to wear masks and social distancing, but it is not a firm directive. And there's not a lot of organization for testing and providing supplies and that sort of stuff. If you look at the state level here in New York, our governor is very involved in directing the actions in response to COVID. We have a very set protocol. You wear your masks, you stay 6 feet away from each other, you wash your hands frequently, you try to go into spaces that have good ventilation. Outside is best. Restricted access to indoor places that can become crowded, right? It's very boom, 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 boom. And here in New York City, it's even more restricted in certain cases. So you have some schools that are on, have open access to their schools for certain populations. Here in New York City, we didn't even open our schools on time, right? Nobody's in my classroom right now. So, we've really, really restricted even more. Those are different layers of government. And sometimes those layers can work very, very well together in supporting one another. And sometimes they operate in conflict. Okay. So that should be good for you guys to get through that one pod if you missed the Zooms on the basic ideas of government, those foundational ideals. Going forward, we're going to be doing the legislative branch next. I would remind you, though, that please attend the Zooms because you will get far more information in them. They will be much more comprehensive, as well as getting your participation points. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope that's helpful. Rewind if you need, and I will see you in class very soon.